North Korea's ambassador is now warning us of nuclear war. In his words, at any moment.
A nuclear war may break out at any moment.
Meanwhile, the Trump administration is ramping up its war on journalists. Could reporters get arrested for doing their jobs?
Will you commit to not putting reporters in jail for doing their jobs?
Well, I don't know that I can make a blanket commitment to that effect.
And journalists who were doing their jobs revealed how the man who would be drug czar weakened federal drug enforcement.
How you doing today?
And some of his peers in Congress had no idea what they were voting for. We have a lot of ground to cover with our guests, Republican State House Speaker Richard Corcoran, Democratic Congressman Charlie Crist, Professor Emeritus Darryl Paulson, and Edward R. Murrow Fellow Adam Goodman. But we'll start with the excessive wait for disaster relief and the potential for fraud and abuse. This is Money, Power, and Politics. So our state government told storm victims to line up for money. What could go wrong?
They've been pushing, they've been fighting, they've been shoving.
Oh, we'll start with the lines that stretch for miles to get these food assistance cards worth hundreds of dollars at supermarkets.
It's ridiculous. We've been here like 8-9 hours.
We've seen those kinds of lines throughout the Tampa Bay area and all across the state. They've triggered traffic snarls even in the middle of the night.
There was traffic at 2 in the morning. We've been here forever.
That's the first problem, the state's distribution system for disaster food stamps. They made storm victims, many elderly and disabled, stand and wait by the thousands in the heat, in some cases for 12 hours or more.
We're waiting to see if they open because that's what they said yesterday and they reopened.
Add to that the chaos and the confusion and frustration when we saw sites in South Florida close early.
We've been trying since 7 in the morning to let them know that it's closed.
You wait for so long, you get here, and then you're hungry and you still have to go to work. And you're told because they're closed, you have to come back another day.
Since 12:30, you decide to close the site. Right. And that is very, very disrespectful to the citizens of Broward County. Senator Bill Nelson tweeted, "This is unacceptable. The state should have been prepared for this." He called on USDA to send additional resources and expedite the process.
They know people coming for free stuff, so they should be prepared.
By midweek, the state reported more than 2 million people had received more than $375 million. That's federal money distributed by the state to people who pre-registered, then showed up with ID.
Just bring picture ID and we can get you in and out of here really quickly.
Which now takes us from the question of the state's preparedness to the question of oversight. The state gives out these money cards based on income and assets and family size and what people say they lost in the storm. We don't know how many people may exaggerate their losses or downplay their income to bilk the system. We do know a similar program was rife with abuse in South Carolina. After floods a couple of years ago, that state was rocked by headlines of fraud. That's millions in fraud when it gave out disaster food stamps. A South Carolina audit found that giving out money to people partly on the honor system carries a high risk for fraud. Okay, please welcome Florida House Speaker Richard Corcoran. Thank you as always for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Craig. Appreciate it.
We've seen fraud with this disaster food stamp program in places like New Jersey years ago, South Carolina. We could, after the fact, see it here in Florida. Is there enough oversight on the front end to make sure that people who are getting this money are in fact truly in need?
Well, first, I mean, the big issue is it's a federal program, so it's not a state issue for the most part. But what we're seeing is the concept is that if you are not on food stamps already, you're not already getting some sort of help from the federal government, you had a hurricane that devastated you some way, shape, or form, and you need additional assistance to move forward, is to try to open up that door for those people to get back on their feet. To your point, there isn't a tremendous amount of oversight for that, technically, for who shows up. There's not a lot of background screening, but it's only temporary to get people back on their feet for the storm. I would hope that most Floridians who were in need would actually utilize those services only if they were in need, but in large part it is a self-reported system. And
it takes comparatively a very small percentage to bilk the system. So could there have been, or should there have been, more oversight, therefore, on the front end?
Well, we created a select committee on hurricane preparedness. Even though that's a federal issue, I think those are the types of issues that we'll look at and see if there's some way that we can assist the federal government in the extent that they have a program like that to make sure there is more accountability. But I think that at the end of the day, what we have to realize is the most important thing is to get people back on their feet and recover. And to the extent that there is a sliver of folks that are engaged in improper behavior, but the overwhelming majority are people who need it, I think that's always should be our focus.
In terms of the process, having people who were storm victims already lacking in food, waiting for 12 hours plus in some cases in the heat. What went wrong here, and how can this be?
I think that the whole, it's a temporary disaster relief program. I think those temporary programs that you put in place at the last minute to try to help people in those types of situations, they're always going to be a degree of willy-nilly to them. That's where I think whether it's the state or the federal government needs to go back and look, hey, we've been through this now several times. We're going to have that temporary assistance program. We got to have a way to execute it better, and there should be better cooperation between the state and the feds in terms of how we disseminate those goods to the people. And so we'll look at that through that committee.
Knowing what you now know, if you were governor, and you're thinking about running for governor, if you were governor now, what would you have done differently to try to alleviate these kinds of lines?
Well, I would say there's a lot of things that we could do differently, but first I want to say that I think our governor has done a tremendous job. I think what has been said widely by Democrats, Republicans, leaders, disaster people throughout the nation is that our governor has done a tremendous job in preparing our state. We literally had a third of our population evacuate, never before, and they all got out safely. But what the purpose of the committee is to say, what were all those things? Not just that, what were all those things? Why did we have such a gas shortage? Why were we having long lines in the evacuation routes? Why were so many power lines knocked down by trees? All of those things the Disaster Preparedness Committee is going to look at. They're going to come up with recommendations, and we'll put forth legislation coming January.
Speaker Corcoran, thanks for your perspective.
Thank you.
Now on to the mess that is politics in Washington. First, the president said we have to do more to fight opioid abuse. Then he picked Congressman Tom Marino to lead that charge. Then we learned Marino sponsored a law passed just last year that made it harder to fight opioid abuse. So after 60 Minutes, the Washington Post dug into that. Marino withdrew his nomination. And as we dug more into the money in politics, we found a couple of Florida lawmakers co-sponsored Marino's laws. So we took a closer look at their contributions from the drug lobby, and we asked them to respond. But we'll start with Congressman and would-be drug czar Tom Marino.
It's been a priority of mine to encourage the DEA to collaborate with companies in the pharmaceutical supply chain.
Last year, Congressman Tom Marino got more than $72,000 from the pharmaceutical supply chain. And last year, he sponsored that law to weaken the DEA's power to stop prescription drug abuse.
How are you doing tonight?
And then he tried to cash in on his early support for President Trump by taking over as our nation's drug czar. Until 60 Minutes and the Washington Post called him out.
He's a great guy. I did see the report. We're going to look into the report.
Well, the report derailed Marino's nomination to lead our nation's drug control policies. But it did not mention the 11 other members of Congress who co-sponsored this controversial law. Tampa Bay Representative Gus Bilirakis co-sponsored Marino's bill in the House. And last year he picked up nearly $80,000 from the drug industry. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio co-sponsored the companion bill in the Senate, and last year he picked up $289,000 from the drug industry. But remember, even as other members of Congress are now saying this law needs to be repealed, they all voted for it last year. So they've either changed their minds after getting bad press, or they did not read or understand what they passed. Okay, please welcome Darryl Paulson, Professor Emeritus of Government, University of South Florida, columnist, author, predictor of things. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here.
I want to start with Marino's law. You have Gus Bilirakis, who through a statement told us he didn't know that this would hamper law enforcement, something that he wants to look into now. Maybe there's some unintended consequences. Doesn't know that for sure. We haven't heard back from Rubio, who also co-sponsored this. But you also have others like Joe Manchin, who basically say they were duped into supporting this. How could that even happen?
Well, I taught Congress for 35 years, and one of the things I taught about was how congressmen make decisions. And oftentimes, they don't know 90% of the bills that come up. They don't know what's in it. They know what's in the committees that they belong to. They're experts in limited areas. So there's a great deal of deferring to the expertise of committees. So 90% of the time when members are ready to vote on an issue, they'll come into the House chambers and they'll ask the Republican doorkeeper, how are the Republicans voting on this? Or they'll find one of the members of the leadership team, the Speaker of the House or the majority or minority leader, and say, how are the Republicans voting on this? Or how are the Democrats voting on this? And that's basically their information. They take cues from other members of Congress who do have the expertise in this area, and they'll follow their judgment. It's a spooky way to do things, but it happens all the time for both Republicans and Democrats. You might remember Nancy Pelosi, when the Obamacare bill was up, said, we'll have to vote for this to see what's actually in the bill.
Midterm forecast. Will the Democrats take over the House and or the Senate?
They're going to have a tough time taking over the Senate because of the 33 seats that are up in the Senate this year, Democrats hold 25 of those. And 10 of those Democratic senators are in states that Donald Trump won by 20% or more. So they've really got a tough road taking back the Senate, even though they only need to pick up 3 seats to take control of the Senate. In the House, the Democrats need to pick up 24 seats, and they have a better chance, and I think an increasingly good chance. All of the political tea leaves, so to speak, are working in the Democrats' favor. The party that doesn't control the White House does best in midterm elections. It almost always happens, big seat gains by them. Trump's popularity is low, so that works to their advantage.
But when President Trump was also unpopular last year when he won?
That's a point to remember, and I spoke to a Democratic group last week, and it's exactly the point I made. I said, don't count on Trump's low popularity to get you over the top in terms of winning elections, because Donald Trump had low ratings in the Republican primaries last year. He had low ratings against Hillary Clinton, and who won both? And I said, obviously Donald Trump. So you have to be very careful in terms of how you analyze certain bits of information.
In the final analysis, will Republicans hold the U.S. Senate, yes?
I think yes, just because the Democrats have such a long road to go and they have to defend 25 of the 33 seats.
In the House of Representatives, do Democrats?
The House, I think they've got a better than even chance, not much more, but maybe 55, maybe 60% chance at most of taking control of the House of Representatives. And a lot depends, obviously. It's always difficult to predict at this point in time. It depends on what happens between now and Election Day. It depends on what the issues are. Depends on how Trump handles issues, and it depends on whether the Democrats can find quality candidates, something they've had a problem doing in the past.
Professor Paulson, thank you much. We'll have you back soon.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, the Treasury Secretary says the stock market will crash if they don't cut taxes. Is he right or wrong? Plus, what kind of tax cuts are we talking about? What does it mean for you? And North Korea is threatening nuclear war. How will Congress respond? We'll go one-on-one with Congressman and former Governor Charlie Crist. President Trump and North Korea's dictator have been trading threats for months. And now a SurveyMonkey poll shows 72% of Americans fear a major war on Trump's watch. And North Korea's dictator said we could have a nuclear war any moment now.
Nuclear war may break out at any moment.
Meanwhile, our economy is humming along and Wall Street analysts are celebrating.
We've had, I think, 26 all-time records since the presidential election. So, I mean, it's just, this market is so strong.
But 30 years after Black Monday, the worst one-day crash in history, those same analysts who are celebrating now say the market may crash again, and soon.
You could see this market tank pretty fast.
And Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin says it will crash if Congress does not pass tax reform. He claims investors are driving the market and hiring managers are adding jobs because they're assuming they'll get tax cuts, since Republicans control the White House and Congress. Plus, Mnuchin has already offered an absolute guarantee that tax reform will pass.
Not only will these be massive tax cuts, but these will be a big simplification. It's going to be a very big simplification.
And he will have a big problem, a very big problem for Republicans if he can't pass it. And Democrats are already tearing it apart.
So why is the Trump administration proposing this immoral plan that will explode the deficit and not grow the economy? Because the plan is very, very good for the super rich members of the Trump administration.
Now, please welcome former Governor and Congressman Charlie Crist. Thank you for joining us.
Craig, it's a pleasure. Always good to be with you.
Let's start with tax reform. Are the people of Florida overtaxed?
Oh, probably. I think that, what we need in the form of tax reform is something that benefits the middle class, if you will. What we've seen in Washington that the administration has talked about, at least preliminarily, has been about a tax cut for the very wealthy. That's not really what we need. We need to help the middle class across our country and in Florida. I am hopeful that that's where we can go. I understand that possibly Speaker Ryan may be looking at something can be similar to that.
Treasury Secretary said if there is no tax reform, no tax cuts this year, then you will see a tanking of the stock market. Is he right or wrong about that?
I don't know. It's incredible what's happened in the stock market. It's at record high, as we all know, over 23,000 just this week. Which is amazing under the current tax structure. So I don't know if we have necessarily a problem as it relates to the stock market vis-a-vis taxes. I think we have a tax problem that relates to the tax code itself. It's too complicated. It needs to be simplified. Reductions would be nice for, as I said, for the middle class.
You've changed parties since then, but you still embrace Reaganomics. In that time, in the 1980s, correct? The belief that cutting taxes, supply-side economics, blew a hole in the deficit, but it was able to generate growth in the long run.
I think what's better in order to have growth is for us to do what I've already done as a new member of Congress with a Republican colleague, Tom Rooney of Florida. We have proposed in a bipartisan bill that we would have a small tax cut for small businesses throughout the country. That's where most jobs are created, Craig, as we all know. So I think trying to give help to small business across our country is the right way to go with tax reductions.
But if this blows $1 trillion+ hole in the deficit over the course of time, are we not losing more ground at a time we're already going broke?
Well, we have enough of a deficit as it is, as we all know. I believe that we need to have a balanced budget amendment for our budget overall to require what we do in Florida. As governor for 4 years, we balance the budget every 4 years. Why shouldn't Washington do the same thing?
With respect to North Korea, do you think the president can launch a preemptive strike on North Korea if he believes that there is an imminent threat they will strike us without approval from Congress?
No, I believe that we ought to have congressional approval. I've signed onto the bill that will do as much. Now, I do think he should have the right to be able to respond, but to initiate without congressional approval, I believe is wrong. I'm concerned about the administration. I think we have to have all co-equal branches of government engaged in something like this, particularly when you're talking about our national security.
What more can we do? What more can Congress do to augment our missile defense system? Where do we go from here?
I think we need to support our military. I've done so already in the Congress, voting for increases that would help our missile defense system. Thank goodness we developed that years and years ago, but now we need to perfect it. Under the current circumstance, dealing with North Korea, that's a real threat. And I understand that administration officials just yesterday have addressed it and said we have to treat it as though the nuclear option from them is something that exists now, to be prudent. And I'm encouraged by Secretary Tillerson, I need to say this too, in his continued desire to have a diplomatic solution. We all would want for that.
Would or should we ever consider a nuclear option on our end, striking North Korea?
Initially?
Yes.
No.
At any point, should we consider nuclear weapons on North Korea?
On any point? Well, let's hope we don't get to that point. Let's stay on the diplomatic trail and hope for cooler heads prevailing.
Congressman Charlie Crist, former governor, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Craig. My pleasure.
Coming up, the Attorney General would not rule out jailing American journalists who are doing their jobs. What does that mean? Which investigative journalists could be arrested under some scenarios? And what might Edward R. Murrow think of that? We'll break it down with Edward R. Murrow fellow Adam Goodman.
Will you commit to not putting reporters in jail for doing their jobs?
Well, I don't know that I can make a blanket commitment to that effect.
Okay, what this means, Adam Goodman, is that the administration will not rule out jailing journalists who don't reveal their sources when subpoenaed, sources of leaked information. Should there be a federal shield law to protect reporters from revealing such information?
Absolutely. It should be a law. And I think what Jeff Sessions was doing, he had his lawyer's hat on, as opposed, you might say, his practical hat. The lawyer's hat saying, you never say, I would never do anything or never prosecute anything as the lead person in the Justice Department. I think the scary part of this is the First Amendment should mean something to everybody in this country and should be worth protecting. So I think this is not a place for rhetoric, but for certainty.
We've been through this before with the Pentagon Papers, certainly under President George W. Bush with Judith Miller. Do you think this will happen again, given the ramping up war against the news media from the Trump administration?
Well, I think the media has, unfairly or unfairly, has brought some of this on themselves. Greg, I mean, their ratings right now in terms of their credibility are way down because the public more and more is seeing them as inflaming versus informing. They got to get back to reporting the news, getting information, reporting the news, and then letting people decide for themselves what to make of it. And I think some of this was brought on themselves, and some of this is a reflection of the times, and of course some of this is a real reflection of the President of the United States.
Devil's advocate here. If a government official has illegally leaked sensitive information, should that journalist then not be compelled by subpoena to reveal who that person was, and if not, face contempt themselves?
I'm all in favor of the truth. However you can get the truth out, and I'd be in favor of that.
Adam Goodman, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, Florida citrus farmers were hammered by Hurricane Irma, and now they could take yet another hit, this one from politicians in Washington. Our citrus industry took some staggering losses after Hurricane Irma, and there is one thing Republicans and Democrats, farmers across the board agree on in Florida. Take a look. It is that our citrus growers need help. You've seen a bipartisan push from Nelson Rubio in the Senate, from our governor, agriculture commissioner. They have been lobbying Congress hard for upwards of $2.5 billion to help our citrus farmers recover. However, Nelson is expressing deep concerns because he claims the White House is holding that up, at least temporarily, perhaps until a November supplement. With that, he is trying to put a hold on one of the president's nominees to try to get things moving here. There are no guarantees, of course, if things get delayed, that they will ever come together with the competing needs in Congress as we speak, plus the press for tax cuts. Folks, that's our show. We will see you again next week for another round of Money, Power, and Politics.